Hi, everyone. This is an older interview I did a few months ago during more of the pandemic. It's with Zachary Smith, who's a Zen priest in San Francisco. When I used to live in California, I used to sit Zen with him in Telegraph Hill. We reconnected over the phone and really explored everything from Zen to Vipassana to psychedelics to parenting to COVID to balancing the practice of Buddhism with a Western perspective. I think it's a great, really fun, long form interview about things that I'm interested in. I hope you find it interesting too. And there you go. Thanks a lot. Maybe that's my first question then, Zach. I was going to ask this later, but what does a Zen Buddhist, what's the right political view for a Zen Buddhist? If that
That's a
makes sense.
really difficult one. Yeah. I mean,
I'd love your thoughts.
I would say, yeah, I would say this, like the, Zen is a Mahayana Buddhist school, and the the Bodhisattva vow, which is the centerpiece of Mahayana Buddhism, uh, says that even though the delusions are inexhaustible and everything is a dharma gate, and you can't humanly step through all of them, and and the Buddha way is either unattainable or unsurpassable, depending on how you translate it. Um, I vow um, to essentially, you know, like accord with all the procedures and rituals and do all good, avoid actions that have negative karmic consequences, and um, and do it all in complete acknowledgement and participation in the mutuality and interdependence of all being. Right. So that actually starts to sound like a political stance, right? It's the main thing is we all do this together, and we all try and wake up together. And if you find yourself behaving in a way that doesn't support that, then um, then stand back for a second and do another and give it another try. Basically, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're kind of, I asked because I was thinking about the Eightfold Path and the concept of the right view. And sometimes I think about when I was sitting in San Francisco, especially after Trump, it felt like every Dharma talk became a kind of diagnosis of uh, the Sangha's reactions to Trump. And then I started
Yeah.
thinking, I wonder if if you actually start thinking about Asian forms of Buddhism and the Bay Area form
Yeah.
of Buddhism, they have different kind of political leanings. And I just wondered how people think about that sometimes. Or if you
Yeah.
think
No, I
about that.
agree. So I mean, I would say that yeah, I think the history of that is complicated, right? So um, and some of the complicated history goes back to the Meiji Restoration, right? So during the Meiji Restoration, famously, there was a whole division of the government that was initially planning on purging the country of Buddhism, right? They were going to they were going to establish um, Shinto as a state religion and suppress and deprecate Buddhism. And after a while, they're like, yeah, it's okay. You can still be here. You need to make these changes though into how you work, and they imposed a number of interesting things, like for example, um, temples had to be passed down from father to son in a hereditary manner, except for certain training temples and so on. And and so on. But what it did was it implanted a sort of big householder class with subtly different interests in the middle of the of the Buddhist hierarchy in Japan, and it had a huge effect on, first of all, the amount of activism that that Zen Buddhists were interested in engaging in, and second of all, kind of the political leanings of of Zen as a whole. And so you the standard story you hear in Japan, not everywhere, but I think a lot of places, is no, you should just be you should just be practicing and also being a resource to your community in the way that Zen priests have been a resource to their community, you know, for a pretty long time, right? So, you know, they're famously roughly 25,000 Soto Zen temples in Japan, all the vast majority of which are these, you know, village, town, or regional temples where the priest has a very particular form of engagement with the community, and everyone, the standard story is you do that, right? I think in the U.S., um, you know, you still have to think about your political engagement in terms of the Bodhisattva vow, but I think a substantially wider range of engagements are possible, right? So if you talk to priests at Zen Center, some of them are doing, um, you know, kind of during the Trump administration, doing activist um, engagement on the border with immigrants, right? And that's how, right? So the counterweight to that is that um, it's pretty important not to be doctrinaire or absolutist about politics as a Buddhist, because in Mahayana Buddhism, the basic axiom is that all of the concepts, categories, and so on that with which we structure our thinking in our lives are provisional and conditioned, right? And so if you find yourself getting deeply attached to a particular conceptual framework for looking at politics, that's probably worth looking at, right? And and the and in particular, when somebody comes to you to meet, right? Um, honestly, the request of practice is to meet that person completely, regardless of who they say they are or who you say they are. Right? Um, so that's a slightly longer answer, and you're right. I mean, I think um, there was a tremendous amount of essentially agonizing, at least at San Francisco, about the election, the unexpected election of Donald Trump, right? And and some people managed to preface their agonized Dharma talks with, you know, I don't want to offend anybody here, and then some people did. Right? So, anyway, yeah.
So, talking, Zach, about doctrine, maybe why did you select Soto Zen then?
Well, I selected Soto Zen for a very particular reason, and that was that my mom selected Soto Zen, and I'm sort of a you know, second generation convert Buddhist, right? My mom was a Zen student in the 60s and 70s, and studied a little with Suzuki Roshi, but mostly with Bill Kwong. Um, who up until recently was the head of the Sonoma Mountain Zen Center. But when I was a kid, he ran a large group in Mill Valley, basically. And so my mom would drag me over there, and I would, uh, Bill Kwan would go around with the stick. He would come up to me, and instead of whacking me on the shoulder, you could hear him breathe a sigh, like, oh. And then he would put the stick up against my back and pull my shoulders up against it and straighten me up, and then go walk around the room and visit a few other people. And then he'd come back, and you could hear him sigh again. And he would go, oh, and then he would do it again. So that's why. I mean, the story after that is I kind of put it down for about 20 years, and then at one point I was looking at my life, and I made a bulleted list that included what I thought of as the parameters of my life. And I looked at it and I thought, that is the ideal life for me. And then I examined my experience of living that life, and I realized that I wasn't liking it very much. It was full of what the Buddhists call suffering, and furthermore, I was being a jerk to pretty much everybody I cared about. I thought, well, all of that is bad, and I will now fix it. And the place I will fix it is San Francisco Zen Center. And of course, I went off and I jumped into that, and none of the things that I thought were going to happen happened in any of the ways that I thought they were going to happen. But after almost 30 years of that, the world feels like it's like a radically different place. So that's what it is.
Internally?
So that's why I picked up that. Sorry?
What feels radically different, internally or externally or both? Or
well, that's an interesting point. So I would say yes to both. What feels radically different from the internal standpoint? Right?
No, keep going. Yes, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and that's okay. What feels radically different from the internal standpoint is that just my everyday experience of living that life, which is very different now. I mean, when I was looking at my life back in the early 90s, I was, playing in rock bands for a living, and had this really sort of, I would say, pretty frenetic, but arty life. And now I'm living with Marcia and our two kids, and I actually have a couple of kids from previous relationships, and I went back to work after a while in the tech biz, but I'm not even doing that anymore. I'm working primarily, really only as a Zen priest, and that's kind of it. So it's a very different life, but the difference doesn't have to do with the particulars so much as it has to do with the experience of being in the middle of it. And the experience of being in the middle of it is so different that it would be hard to say exactly why. It's just that the baseline, the emotional baseline of the mind of practice is a kind of unconditioned appreciation that's indistinguishable from love. And that's kind of what it feels like a lot of the time. It's not like I don't ever, lose track of that, but that's the baseline. And then in terms of the external world, I don't know how much the external world has changed, but my my perceptions of it have changed sufficiently that um, I'm pretty sure I didn't know back in the day what was going on in the external world, and I'm not sure if I know a lot better now, but I certainly things just radically different than it was. Like the things that I thought were motivating people, the things that I thought that I assumed people thought were important, or that I thought I observed people attending to, the the et cetera. All of it, right? Um, the 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 drivers uh, for for culture and how they work on a day-to-day basis. All of those things feel really different to me now, and since they probably haven't changed that much, it's just that my perception is radically different.
So, Zach, then do you find your Zen practice to be a, maybe an ethical system, a philosophy, a religion, all three? I mean, what?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's what I would say. Um, yes, then it contains a kind of large scale philosophical system and conceptual framework. Um, a lot of which is inherited from the Pali Canon, some of which is inherited from the Mahayana sutras, and some of which is inherited in a way more elliptical way from the traditional literature, most of which was written down in the Long Dynasty, and some parts of which were written in the Tang Dynasty, right? Um, so, and then so there have been additions to that um, uh, from other parts of the Zen world, Japan, notably, the Soto tradition, right? Um, so it has that. It's also got an ethics, which again is mostly the ethics of Mahayana. Right? Um, the thing that that it has that makes it more of a religion um, as opposed to just a philosophical and ethical system is that it increasingly come to see that it emphasizes devotion, right? Um, uh, like when you do monastic practice in Zen, it's it's not at all uncommon to find people asking, "Hey, why are we doing this stuff?" Right? Like, why are we eating in this really particular way? Why are we sitting in why do we pick this particular meditation posture? Why do you step over the threshold to the zendo or the Buddha hall um, with the foot that's nearest the doorpost and everything else, right? And the standard answer to that is that it's a it's a it's a set of forms that buttress and contribute to mindful engagement, right? But and that's true, but it actually goes deeper than that. The all of those forms, including zazen, are fundamentally devotional activities, right? You just do them because it's the request that you've been given, right? And you do them wholeheartedly and without struggle, right? And if you can do that, there's a kind of freedom that arises out of that devotion, right? Um, and also it points up the way in which we struggle with freedom, right? We if you go to, this is true, I think, in monasteries the world over, but certainly if you go to a Western Zen monastery, what you discover is that people have this kind of um, uh, more or less, some people are more ambivalent, people are less ambivalent, but they have this sort of ambivalent relationship with the formal devotional practice of Zen, right? And and they express that ambivalence almost completely in subtle ways in which they try to rake back control from the schedule, from the the formal practice, from the request that they receive to do this activity in this particular way, and so on. And that's the dynamic of formal practice generally, is that it shows you the way in which the self asserts itself, and self narration um, uh, you know is constantly coming up and constantly driving activity. And it also shows the way that lurking right on the edge of that is this other mode of engagement that offers a kind of freedom from all of that. That is, it's, first of all, it's beneficial, right? And second of all, it works in a way that goes beyond simple benefit. It's kind of transformative, right? Um, so, so that's what I would say. It's all of those. It's a religion. It's a philosophy. It's an ethical system, right?
Zach, in my own practice now that I'm sitting more at the Diamond Sangha here in Hawaii, I'm sitting every morning or twice a week at 6 a.m. with the people who live there,
Yeah.
which is nice. And
Nice.
the first time I had some challenges with the salutations that we do at the end of the sit, but then I spoke to the monk and he said, instead of thinking of them as an external, think of it as a salutation to the internal Buddha nature. And I felt like that was such a good way to frame it, instead of, some people have problems with like an external God, or I thought this was a nice way that they framed it. So I actually kind of like the ritual aspect now, but I can see how it can be off-putting, especially to Western kind of individualism.
Yeah, I think it is something to get over, and I experienced some of that as well, particularly early on, right? The particularly when you go to Tassajara, the services are really long, and and after them comes a short work period and then breakfast, and so by about midway through the service, I was getting up at 3:30, and service was finishing up around, I don't know, like 7:30 or something like that. By the time I was, first of all, almost fainting from hunger and anoxia from chanting so vigorously, and I was like, wait a second, what did I sign up for? But in the end, that's right. It's the once you find a way to frame it that allows it to kind of take root, it's good. Like I remember Eiichi Roshi, there's a famous story that he tells about how kind of somebody was objecting to um, the externalities that were referenced in the ceremony, and they were going, "What is this? Are we talking about some sort of God figure or something like that here?" And he says, "I walked to the window, I pulled back the curtain, and there was the mountain." He said, "What about that?" so that also is a way to think of it too. It's like just the unbelievable power and glory of the natural world that gave birth to us, basically. So there's another way to look at it. But yes, absolutely, the Buddha nature within, the Buddha nature that we share with everybody, because we're all, let's be clear, um, uh, all of our minds are made up out of the minds of others, the things that people said to us, the behaviors that they demonstrated for us, and so on and so forth. All of that. Um, it's a we're a colony, right?
So,
So
Zach,
you can
going
yeah, go ahead.
going in that line, and not to proselytize, but in the West, there's the trend of kind of mindfulness and kind of self-help meditation, apps, Calm,
Yeah.
and all that. Why would you encourage someone to actually develop a deeper practice in a kind of a religious setting, like a Zen temple, or even a Vietnamese kind of practice, any of the Zen or Buddhist lineages? What would that offer to them instead of just an app? I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, there is a lot of about how that works, right? So people, there's a time when people just couldn't stop writing about, like famously during the Tang Dynasty, the five ranks, for example, Tozan's five ranks. But there's a lot of other ones, silent illumination, all those things that talk about the way in which practice generates its own kind of plate tectonics, and over time, your mind and body shift in this way that goes beyond help and benefit into some kind of, like I was saying at the beginning, kind of transformation of what it actually is like to be in the world as a living human, right? Which is awesome, right? But the benefits of mindfulness are nothing to sneeze at. If you can discover a way to uh, to um, to stay close to what's important, uh, to act uh, flexibly and skillfully in the middle of the unquestionably difficult social and business world that we currently inhabit, and why not, right? I think all of that's okay. But I would say that the practice as a whole done in the way that that is recommended by any number of Buddhist schools, but certainly the Zen school offers something that goes beyond that. And it's just a matter of engaging it and giving it time to work, and also engaging it in a way that doesn't run entirely on expectation. And that's the other objection that people have about secular mindfulness, is that it puts in place a set of expectations which in some ways are a barrier to that deeper development. The only answer I have to that is, if you read all the literature, it's full of aspirational formulas, right? So everybody is trying to plant some kind of aspiration, right? And having an aspiration to be a more effective engineer or something like that is not bad, but it's good to have a system in place whereby those aspirations get I'm not sure exactly what the right word is. Where you're asked to check them out on a regular basis, because they can also stand in your way. Right? You can easily find yourself sitting there going, "Why are my aspirations not being fulfilled?" And find that your practice is a source of frustration and disappointment, rather than letting it run on its own core. Right?
Anyway. You know, it's interesting, Zach, when you talk about that, aspirations, you know, I feel like I started with meditation with Vipassana, doing a Goenka, you know, and they have kind of a formula that they go through. And the Zen practice kind of just emphasizes the physicality of it, and they don't emphasize any anchors. So for me, it's kind of re-exploring meditation without the anchor. But then I've been doing a lot of reading about Zen, and I guess sometimes even in Japan, they still practice Vipassana, even in a Zen frame. So I'm just curious what your thoughts of anchoring and anchorless and, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody that practices meditation in a serious way for an extended period of time comes up with either comes up with or receives from their teacher a collection of skillful techniques that allow them to work with their own particular cycle of attention and so on. Right? It's easy to say, oh, you know, shikantaza is just sitting, right? Yes, that's true, but everybody, I think, has the experience of wanting and benefiting from in the pursuit of shikantaza, right? Some technique. So, you know, I mean, famously in the Rinzai school, the techniques mostly involve practicing with koans, right? Great, that's awesome. If you look around the Soto school, you start to see places where people have suggested other, you know, just very specific physical techniques around, say, what you do with the breath, what you do with the gaze, what you do with your with the input from your auditory sense and so on. I think that's inevitable, right? I think people want and benefit from an anchor, and then and want and benefit from an invitation to right effort, right? And what happens after that is that right effort is the effort that naturally tails out to no effort as the mind settles and the body aligns itself, right? So, and at some point, then the effort there's no effort, and it's just sitting, and that's fine. But it's, you know, there might be this idea that somehow no effort is best, and sitting with an anchor or with a particular set of physical practices or something like that is not as good. No, that's incorrect, right? That's even sort of heretical, right? The sitting is you know, shikantaza is actually completely doing what you're doing now, and if that involves a particular breath practice or something like that, then so be it. Right? That's okay. Anyway, that's what I'd say.
Talking about anchors, does Soto have any esoteric kind of practices? I'm just curious.
Yeah,
some of the Tibetan schools, like very kind of mystical, esoteric. I'm just curious about the Soto Zen, if they have any of those.
So the reason I mentioned there are a lot more. There are a lot less, fancy or something like that. Like the kind of things you hear are there's a guideline for the gaze that's called um, gazing at distant mountains. Have you heard this?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. The idea is that once you settle, you let your gaze settle such that your peripheral vision is as wide as it possibly can be, and the visual, your eyes are not wide squeaking open, but kind of relaxed and downcast. But with the relaxed and downcast eyes and the very wide peripheral vision, if you can just let your eyes settle there, there's this like really kind of surprisingly vast visual field that can just arrive moment by moment in your in your visual cortex, basically. And the request is to enact that in such a way that your gaze is completely relaxed but completely comprehensive. So, and the model for it, like I said, it's called gazing at distant mountains. It's as though you're looking, you're taking in as much as you possibly can of a mountain range that's way far away on the horizon, right? And so those techniques are esoteric in the sense that nobody teaches them in Zazen instruction. they're like
Buried in some scripture or something.
They're buried mostly in instructions that are passed down from teacher to student, and then every now and again somebody will write a book with a few of them. But basically, it's stuff that's passed down from teacher to student. And they're quite specific, right? There's another one that has to do with the breath. This is actually sort of, I think, I'm not sure where it's from, but my guess is that it's related to Tai Chi and Chinese martial arts. But that your breath actually should be experienced as a wheel that comes through the middle of your body, and when you breathe out, it's the forward part of the wheel that essentially turns into your hara, and when you breathe in, it's the back leg of the wheel which comes up your spine and lands kind of at the forward crown of your head, right? And so you breathe in that way as a kind of visualization, right? So and again, as you do that, the effort and attention that's required to do that sort of settles slowly, and then finally it would be hard to say who's making the effort, right? But there's another example, basically.
Zach, right now in your daily sits, how are you focusing your effort? I guess is not. I don't know if that's the right term, but
that's a good question. What I'm working on is this, right? So I've long been working on my personal cycle of attention. I mean, I think everybody has a cycle of attention, right? Mine has a particular length and quality and so on, and some of the things about its quality depend on uh, how agitated I am or how much sleep I got last night and all the rest of that. But basically, it's pretty familiar to me now, and what I noticed over time was that there are subtle ways in which I still emphasize kind of engagement with the absolute over self-narration and thinking, right? So that's one, and so one of the activities I work with is noticing when that preference arises and just letting it go, right? So that's one, and then the other one has to do with noticing the way in which, I don't know, the way in which my image of my idea of what my inner life is like is actually distorted by my desire to construct a sort of unitary continuous narrative of self. And actually, the truth is, the more I pay attention, the more I notice that actually the mode of self-construction, self-narration, and emotionally driven engagement is always present with this mode of kind of unloaded, broad, receptive attention, and that other mode is there right alongside it in a way that you can actually stay connected with even in the middle of thinking and so on. And so I've been trying to explore the details of that relationship as intimately as I can, and it's been good. It's a long process, but where I am with it right now, it really feels like the promise in the Fukanza Zengi is that Zazen is the Dharma gate of repose and bliss, right? And I remember once asking Paul, my teacher, how is, sitting on a bed of nails, making mistake after mistake after mistake, the Dharma gate of repose and bliss? And I I kind of forget what he said, but my experience at this point is that most of the things that made it feel like sitting on a bed of nails, making mistake after mistake after mistake, settle with that when I practice in that way. That it's just basically.
I think with when I've done longer sits, like a 10-day, I think the bliss aspects come very clear, as well as like the nightmare kind of, places that I mean the goal is just to have no preference of either, I guess, but that's much harder. This just automatically connects me then, just the connection between Zen or even meditation and psychedelics is just more and more apparent sometimes when you sit on long or even short sits, so I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of experience with psychedelics. I did a ton of high school of acid in high school and up through college, and less frequently, because it would have to be less frequently, or I wouldn't have been able to walk around without bumping into things and so on. But less frequently as I got older. But I did a lot, right? And what I remember about it is that, I mean, it had all the features that people usually describe, right? But what was the most compelling about it was that in the middle of all that business with the walls flexing and patterns appearing everywhere, and that kind of spinning thought in this way that was really sort of exhilarating and exciting. There was the sense of kind of an imperturbable peace, right? And in some ways, that feels like the same trajectory as sitting. And then here's the other thing. Having done all that acid, when I get in the middle of a sesshin, my eyes and ears kind of run riot. Because I don't know if that's true for everybody, but I always assumed it was because I was predisposed to it by doing all that acid. But be walking in behind somebody and their garment will take on some sort of elaborate pattern and sort of flex and wave around and so on and so forth. So that also is kind of fun. But mainly it's that sense of being settled and quiet and imperturbable in the midst of all this activity, right? That what was the crux of it, and I think it's great that experience is available, and like the good news about the monastic living is that if you wig out, then usually there come people that take you by the hand and lead you to your road. Where when I was tripping, except for the first time when my parents gave it to me, right? When I was tripping in high school and college, there was not always clear there was somebody there to take me by the hand and lead me. Anyway.
No, I think that's one of the reasons why being part of a sangha is so important, because if you do have the negative, dark night experience, there's at least a vessel to help contain it. I just wonder if you've had any thoughts about the dangers of meditation. I mean, the same as the dangers of psychedelics.
I've had some very dark nighty experiences while sitting. I did a sesshin a number of years ago now where I went into it with a kind of athleticism, working with a particular kind of breath technique, and I also I took on this practice where I would only, the eating is very formal, and you don't take food ever. You're served food, and I had this practice where I was eating only the first scoop of each of the 3 bowls that were put in front of me. So that someone, regardless of the size of the first scoop, even if they only managed to get a couple of cashews into my bowl, I'd bow, and that would be it, right? And all that seemed fine at the beginning, and actually it was pretty marvelous for the first few days. And then, like after day 4 or something like that, it was like somebody flipped a switch in my head, and I was in this just kind of horrific fugue state. I was having really disturbingly violent and awful images arise in my head, and I felt very agitated emotionally and really just awful. And I think that's a danger. I think it's possible to overdo it. My take on what happened to me was that I was starved and oxygen. Basically, I was the breath thing I was doing was to breathe out and then rest in the place that your body makes at the bottom of the breath until my diaphragm specifically told me that it was time to breathe in. And if you do that for a while, you can have these long pauses where you're essentially not breathing, right? And it's always tempting. There's a little tiny temptation to stretch it out just a little bit longer, right? And so, and I kind of, self-played it out a little bit as well. And so after a while, I was really not getting enough air. And it was difficult, and it took several days to work itself out. I was like, okay, for the rest of the session, I'm going to just breathe however I want, and I'm going to eat a lot. And it actually made a tremendous amount of difference. And by the end of the time, I felt exhausted, like I'd swum the English Channel or something like that. But I felt good, but then I had this experience working in memory that was actually quite difficult to undergo. It was very, very hard, actually. And I think it's a right. I think it's good to be careful. It's good to know. I mean, the bodhisattva about the delusions are inexhaustible. It's easy to trick yourself into doing stuff that's not that good for you. even in the context of something as well defined as a Zen sesshin, right?
Well, I think the response I've heard from people about that usually is that it's like the same as if you went to the gym and, tried to bench press 400 pounds versus whatever, 100 pounds, you're going to get hurt. So the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Meditation, you have to know your limits and be stretched appropriately or whatnot.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right.
One of the things in Japan, there was the gas attacks in the 90s, 1995, the Shinriko.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kind of a new age cult that had some, the cult leader. The one danger with these kind of very intense practices is that sometimes it leads to the ability to manipulate people. Because it breaks down their ego, and you can then kind of insert other elements into the ego. How did you maintain a kind of positive relationship with your teachers and elders or Sangha?
Yeah.
To avoid that. I mean, or what should be people looking for to avoid, Asahara as their guru?
Yeah, I think that it's a problem that it's not exactly inevitable, but I think it showed up in enough places in the world, certainly in the West, certainly obviously in the West, but you read the poetry of EQ, all of that same stuff is attested in his poetry, right? Both the way in which practice can become formal and stuffy, or like, it can become a pursuit of riches, because one of DQ's objections to his fellows at Daitokuji was that they were all like pursuing rich donors so they could get nicer robes and so on and so forth, right? So there is that, and then also his kind of binging on sex and alcohol and so on, and all just right out in front in his poetry. All of that stuff is there, right? The required humility is there right up front, right in the Bodhisattva vow, right? If it says delusions are inexhaustible, and what that means is that wherever you are, you should check yourself, right? And you should stay close to the momentary particulars in a way that softens and aerate fixed ideas and so on, because otherwise it's really easy to get attached to stuff. Absolutely, right? And the famously, so when my teacher was Baker Roshi's student, right? And what he says is that when he finally got a chance to talk to his teacher about his kind of impropriety, um, uh, Baker said, the only reason why you think any of that stuff is wrong is because you're not enlightened, basically, which is fundamentally delusion, right? Now, to be fair to Richard Baker, Mr. Richard Baker is way different now. And I think he, in the end, learned a lot from that whole experience, and he's been tremendously helpful to a lot of people. But that really was a problem, and it caused a huge disruption in the lives of a bunch of people that didn't deserve to have that disruption, and it practically killed off in some ways the Zen practice, at least in that part of the world, which would have been kind of tragic. So my sense is, what I look for is humility and simplicity, and a kind of holding self-concern lightly, right? And the problem is that often people who are go-getters, like Baker was, and he did a marvelous thing setting up Zen Center, right? He really did. He was great, right? But the problem is that it's easy for them to not hold self-concern lightly, because they've gotten to where they are and they've become the person they are by emphasizing self-concern, right? So it's good to check each other. It's good to check yourself, and it's good to stay close to the kind of humility that's inherent in your vows, basically.
So what should pupils then be looking for, that same humility and simplicity then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Humility and simplicity, and a willingness to both question themselves and be questioned by others. Right? If you don't see that, then
look somewhere else. Got it. Yeah. So maybe one of my last questions, Zach, then is, in terms of a parent, then how does that play into how you parent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, parenting is a stupendous field for practice. I mean, it's got everything, right? It's got formal activity, and which changes over time, but initially it's changing diapers and giving baths and all the rest of that sort of thing, and then over time it graduates into picking your daughter up from school and taking her to like that. But it's got plenty of work that you can dedicate yourself to in the way that work is fruitful, right? And it also has this marvelous opportunity to become really close to another being in the middle of their development into a full-fledged human, with all of the aspects of humanity that we're familiar with, including the predilection for suffering and the creation of difficulty for themselves and so on. And so to really take it as an important place to first of all learn about that, because you really learn about it if you watch, right? Because no, even if you have a great memory, nobody really remembers what it was like to learn how to suffer and to learn how to like. I remember my now adult daughter, not one of the kids I'm currently living with, but my daughter that's now a college professor at UT, talking to her on the phone one day when she was like 2, maybe not even, but in any case, something like that. And she said, Dad, I just discovered that I can talk to myself without talking out loud. Isn't that amazing? And then it goes either downhill or uphill from there, depending on how you look at it, right? But you can observe the way that that self comes into being, in the way that all of the Buddhist literature talks about it, with complete with the grasping and aversion, complete with the self-reification and self-narration, complete with the 12-fold chain of causation and everything else, right? You can watch it happen, and that is a powerful lesson, right? And then you can help, right? Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I have a daughter, remember, and every day it's a fun, entertaining experience. So now I can definitely see her mind becoming more self-aware. So that's interesting to think about.
How old is she now?
She's 3.5. She's going to, she loves her school, and
great.
I wish, hopefully the COVID stuff ends. I mean, here in Hawaii, we're kind of in we're like one of those islands where the Japanese people still think World War II is going on. The number of rules we have is just endless, but hopefully, she's very lucky. She doesn't have to wear a mask at her school, and at least she has that. And, we're hopefully, here in Hawaii is very, we have such a strong community, and it's just so different than the mainland. I don't know if we could have survived being in the mainland, honestly, for the last 2 years. But I mean, I think SF's doing better. You know what I mean? So from what I hear from my friends,
SF's doing okay. But I mean, I think I think the care that Hawaii has been taking is probably good, and the only issue that I ran across, so we were in the Big Island early on in the summer. The issue that I ran across is a bunch of people, I think quite correctly, were going, hey, things are still not totally solid here. Why are we all of a sudden trying to ramp up the tourist industry really hard, right? And I thought that seemed like a reasonable debate to have, right? Yeah.
No, it's a very complicated debate, because then, I went to Florida in July, which is the other side of the coin with no rules. And then it's just fascinating to see the differences. And it's funny because now they have about the same amount of cases and the same amount of people per population in the hospital. So one's fully closed and one's fully open.
Yeah.
So, if you do the balance of the mental health and the economic issue, it's a very complex balance. But here in Hawaii, I think most people are very favorable to the restrictions. Yeah. So each place, I kind of believe in federalism, where people kind of choose what they want. So here, I think most people are very content with the rules and more rules, you know what I mean? So, but it's fine. My only concern is just children, to see what term issues are. But, for me, the funny thing is, some of the, I'm just happy the Zen temples open, because they were closed forever. And even though it's all outdoors in the lanai, and they just were very, very nervous. Especially when they have older people who sit there. So
and they're a resident, a conjugate resident facility. That was the the kind of strictest set of guidelines, at least set down by the state of California around COVID, so I can understand how that's an issue. I just on that front, I am going to be sitting in person at Zen Center, one day sitting on the 6th of November. So that's where they're at, which is pretty nice, actually. It's great.
Oh, have they been? They're finally reopening, or
they're finally reopening. I mean, I get to come in because I'm a non-resident senior priest, but they also have a group of commuters for the current present practice period, and they're inviting in all the commuters for the both for the one day sitting this coming month and also probably for the sesshin next month. So that's kind of amazing, right? So that's pretty open. They still haven't started up a regular Saturday program, but they're working on it.
Okay. I just wonder, as a religious kind of person, do you feel like some of the freedoms were kind of infringed on?
Yeah, I think I think that's a complicated thing. I mean, obviously, I understand why they're trying to take care of their residents, right? They have a lot of people living there who if they got COVID or even a breakthrough case after the vaccine, they could very well get severely ill or die, right? So that's not very good, right? But I think
but that was a decision by themselves, right? Not from the state, or was it from the state?
That's correct. Yeah, I think in terms of the state, I guess, I mean, I never felt excessively restricted by the state guidelines. I mean, there are a few of them I probably broke a little bit. Like I chose the pandemic to do a whole bunch of really long distance solo bike riding. So I hardly had talked to anybody, right? But it was like extreme social distancing, but I didn't stay out. Right? So maybe that was kind of bending the rules or something. But I'm not a I'm not a small business owner. I'm not somebody who livelihood and the livelihood of my employees depends on my making money. And that I talked to a bunch of people. I met a guy early on in the pandemic in El Dorado County who ran a whitewater rafting thing, and he was really struggling. And he was a great guy and had like incredibly kind of positive outlook and really, his heart was completely in the right place, and so on and so forth. But he was really having a hard time with it. And my guess is that the state, if they had the energy, foresight, and willingness to do it, could have done a much better job of calibrating the rules for to make them less onerous for people like that, basically. So so I think it was difficult, but I think he and a bunch of other small business owners felt like they were being unnecessarily restricted, in spite of their willingness to take cautionary measures and so on and so forth. And by comparison, the restaurant business in North Beach, things were closed for a while, but actually not that long. And that after a while, people were everybody built a park and they were dining outside, right? And I think a lot of people did fine during the pandemic, but
I think that troubles me is that we were saying about the simplicity and humility of leaders. I think that's what frustration for the right, rafting guy, that you couldn't, they would, if you question anything, then they, either label you as something or not, or so.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Yeah.
It's a very challenging time. And I think, we're lucky maybe if we work from home or have certain skills. We'll see in 10 years what the the true costs are of the pros and cons. We'll see.
Yeah.
But it's funny though, because in the last year, I became probably more inclined to lean towards individualist freedom in making choices. Because when you start, there's this Japanese book called One Straw Revolution, and it's about gardening. Have you heard of it?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, we have a kind of a ego that we think we can control nature, but in the end, it's just so beyond our grasp. You know what I mean? It almost seems so. It's the same with the virus, and we can try and control it, but it's like the weeds. It eventually will just come through. Yeah, you know what I mean? So
yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's one of the primary features of the human condition. We have this dream of understanding and control that's utterly delusive, right? It's not. You might think that's sad, but actually, it's not sad. It's just something. It's because nature is magnificently more complicated and ungraspable than we usually give it credit for. But yeah, totally agree. And it's an occasion for humility and simplicity, right? So.
Anyway, Zach, I really appreciate your time. I want to.
Yeah.
Oh, one last question. I was going to say I was going to send the metta, but Zen doesn't really have that. It seems like, but that's the one other thing I really love about kind of the Vipassana school. I haven't practiced, but do you have any thoughts, or is there any kind of Zen metta?
Well, I mean, San Francisco Zen Center regularly chants the Metta Sutta, right? And metta practice has at least in the San Francisco Zen Center tradition has kind of gotten adopted as a valuable practice and kind of object for practice, both sitting and also standing and walking. Right. So yeah, I'm a firm believer in metta.
Great. Well, I want to send you and your family and all of San Francisco a lot of metta. I'll sit next and try to send you guys. Is it cool?
Wonderful. Yeah, that's marvelous. And I hope it was helpful. And thank you so much for thinking of it and for offering the opportunity. I really, really appreciate it. So.
No, I could ask you hundreds of questions more. I think it's a whole, it's an endless practice, a life practice. So
it is. Yeah, definitely.
Great. Thanks so much, Zach. Have a nice day. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye.